Hello and welcome to today's edition of the Daf Yomi, Daf 21 on the day. We're in Arakhin Daf edition. If the one living in it, either renter consecrates a house, he pays the rent to the temple treasury. The Gemara expressed surprise at the last statement of the Brayta. If the one living in the house consecrates it, how can the renter consecrate it? Mezwan states, when a man shall sanctify his house to be sacred in Leviticus 27:14, from which is derived that just as one's house is in his possession, so too anything that one consecrates must be in his possession. If so, the renter cannot consecrate the house, as he is not its owner. Then one answers that this is what the Brayta is saying. If the one renting out the house consecrates it, the one living in it pays the rent to the temple treasury. So what does that mean? If the owner of a rented house rents out the house and then consecrates it, the house is consecrated and the rental agreement is voided. If the renter continues to live in the house, he has misused consecrated property. Rambam Sefer Flower, Hilchot Aricha V'Rachmim, 6:30. The unit commentator asks, since the house currently belongs to the renter, how can the owner of the house consecrate it? The one answer is that the rental agreement is cancelled when the owner consecrates the house to the Rambam. Others explain that the owner can consecrate only the value of the house over and above that which the renter is paying. Therefore, after the owner consecrates the house, the renter and the temple treasury own the house together, but as it is unclear who owns which part of the house, living in the house is considered misuse of consecrated property. The Jerusalem Talmud distinguishes between a case where the renter had already paid rent and a situation where he had not yet paid. If the renter had already paid, then the house is considered like his property and the owner cannot consecrate it. By contrast, right here is discussing a case where the renter did not yet pay rent, which means the house is not like his property and owner can consecrate it. Some commentaries distinguish between a case where the renter rented a specific house and a situation where he rented a house without specification. If the renter was for a specific house, that house is his property and the owner of the house cannot consecrate it. The Brayta here is discussing a case where the owner rented a house without specifying in which one. Consequently, he can consecrate it and give the renter a different house. And that's from the Ramban. The Gemara asks, if the one renting out the house consecrates it, how is it possible for the renter to live in it? Since the house is consecrated property, he is standing liable for the prohibition against misuse of consecrated property by living there. Furthermore, why must he pay the rent to the temple treasury? Since he misused consecrated property, the payment of the rent... Sorry about this. The payment of rent immediately leaves the state of consecration and becomes non-sacred. So to explain it more, Kevan dema'al beis nafek le zechor lechulen. Misuse of consecrated property causes the property to be desacralized, as is taught in the Mishnah Mila 19b. There was no misuse after misuse with regard to consecrated property. I.e., if one who misused consecrated property item is immediately desacralized, and the prohibition of misuse no longer applies to it. Here too, one who lives in a consecrated house has misused consecrated property by the value of the rent he owes. He must therefore pay the equivalent of his rent plus an additional fifth to the temple treasury as payment for misuse of consecrated property. This money is not considered payment of rent, but a monetary fine for one who misused consecrated property. Rashi explains that a renter living in a consecrated house desacralizes the house itself. The version of the Gemara that Rashi had read, since he benefited from the misuse of consecrated property, the house immediately leaves the state of consecration and becomes non-sacred. Tosafot disagree with Rashi, and the value of the rent is desacralized, but not the house itself. The Gemara answered, the Brayta is discussing a case where one renting out the house says, when the payment of the rent will come to me, the money shall be consecrated. The Gemara asked, how is it possible for the one renting out the house to consecrate money he will receive in the future? After all, a person cannot consecrate an entity that has not yet come into the world, with its principle previously. Rav Yehuda says, in accordance with his opinion, this is Brayta, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that a person can consecrate an entity but that has not yet come into the world. Some say that Rav Papa said to Abaye, and some say that it was Rav Mari Bar Hama said to Rav Chisda. In all accordance with whose opinion is Brayta, is it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that a person can consecrate an entity that has not yet come into the world? He said to him, rather, in accordance with who else's opinion could this Brayta be? Whereas in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir. With regard to those obligated to pay valuations, the court repossesses their property to pay their debt to the temple treasury. With regard to those obligated to pay valuations, the court repossesses their property for their debt after the assessment has been performed. Same applies to those obligated to pay assessments. That's what 315c. Let's say David. There are two ways in which the court repossesses property, both of which are used in the cases of valuation as well as assessments. First, the court takes a person's property as collateral in order to force him to pay. Second, the court repossesses and sells property and uses the money as payment. See Rambam Sefer Fla, Hilchas Avicha V'Rachim 314, Rabbeinu Tam in Tosfot on Bava Metzia, 114b, Rashi on Bava Metzia 113b. With regard to those obligated to pay valuation and assessments who have not yet paid their debt, the court repossesses any item found in their possession and sells it to pay their debt to the temple treasury. Rambam Sefer Fla, V'Rachim 314. With regard to those obligated to bring sin offerings and guilt offerings, the court does not repossess their property. Since one is obligated to bring them for atonement, he would not delay bringing them. With regard to those obligated to bring burnt offerings and peace offerings, with regard to those obligated to bring sin offerings and guilt offerings who have not fulfilled their obligation, the court does not repossess their property. Since one is obligated to bring these offerings in order to achieve atonement, he would not delay bringing them. By contrast, the court does repossess property of those obligated to bring burnt offerings, peace offerings. The reason is that one is not obligated to bring these offerings in order to achieve atonement, and therefore there is a concern that he might delay bringing them. Although his offering is accepted only if he brings it of his own volition, he is coerced until he says, "I want to do so." In Sefer Red Hilchah Matzah Kabbalah 14:17. With regard to those obligated to bring sin offerings and guilt offerings, the court does not repossess their property. Since one is obligated to bring them for atonement, he would not delay bringing them. With regard to those obligated to bring burnt offerings and peace offerings, I just said that, the court repossesses their property. Since these offerings are not obligatory for atonement, one might delay bringing them. Although one is obligated to bring burnt offerings and peace offerings, does not achieve atonement. When the Mishnah employs the term achieve atonement in the context of peace offerings and burnt offerings, the attention is to the offering being accepted by God, as there is no atonement associated with either of these offerings, see Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagolah, until he brings the offering of his own volition. As it is stated, he shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting of his own volition. Leviticus 1:3. Nevertheless, the court coerces him until he says, "I want to do so," and likewise, you say the same with regard to women's bills of divorce. If the court rules that a man must divorce his wife, but he will not comply, a Jewish court anywhere and at any time flogs him until he says, "I want to do so," and he writes a bill of divorce. Although he was coerced to write it, this is a valid bill of divorce because the man really wishes to comply with the mitzvot and to distance himself from sin. It's only his evil inclination that has overcome him, compelling him to refuse to listen to the court. When the court flogged him, it weakened his inclination, and therefore he said, "I wish to do so." It is considered a divorce of his own volition. And that's in Rambam Sefer Nashim, Hilchot Gerushin 220. Rav Papa says, sometimes with regard to those obligated to bring sin offerings, the court does repossess their property. And likewise, there are occasions involving those obligated to bring burnt offerings where the court does not repossess their property. Rav Papa elaborates, with regard to those obligated to bring sin offerings, the court repossesses their property in the case of a sin offering of a Nazarite. So, just to explain a little bit here about the Nazarite, the sin of the Nazarite, Chatas Nazir. In the case of one who is obligated to bring a sin offering of a Nazarite, the court repossesses his property. There is concern lest he delay bringing the offering because its sacrifice is not required for him to become permitted to drink wine. This halach is in contrary to the opinion of Rav Papa. Rambam Sefer Voda Hilchot Matzah Kabbalah 4:17. When the Nazarite completes the period of his vow, he must bring 2 lambs as offerings, a female as a sin offering and a male as a burnt offering, as well as a ram as a peace offering. Numbers 6:13-21. He shaves his hair and burns it beneath the pot in which the ram sacrifices as a peace offering is cooked. After these offerings have been sacrificed, for his period of Nazariteship has ended, the former Nazarite is no different from anyone else. The halacha of a Nazarite discussed in depth in Tractate Nazir. And there's a picture here of a Nazarite having his head shaved in the chamber of the Nazarites. It since the master says in Nazir 45a, if the Nazirite shaved, a Nazirite who brings the offering to the temple first slaughters the sin offering, then the burnt offering, and subsequently the peace offering, after which he shaves. If he shaved after the sacrifice of the sin offering or the burnt offering is fulfilled the obligation of shaving, the halacha is according to the ruling of the Mishnah in Nazir 45a, Lamed Sefer Flor Hilchot Nazirut 8.2. After the sacrifice of one of the three Nazirite offerings, either the burnt offering, the peace offering, or the sin offering, he fulfills the obligation of shaving. And if the blood of one of these offerings was sprinkled on his behalf, in the case of a Nazirite who brings his offering to the temple, if the blood of one of these offerings was sprinkled on his behalf, permitted to drink wine and to become richly impure from a corpse, despite the fact that he is not yet shaved, this halacha is according to the Gemara in Nazir 46a, Lamed Sefer Flor Hilchot Nazirut 8.5. Sorry about this, just waiting for a call. Nazirite is permitted to drink wine and to become richly impure from a corpse. Therefore, there is a concern that Nazirite who has already sacrificed a burnt offering or peace offering might be negligent with regard to the sin offering, not bring it, and therefore the court repossesses property in this particular case. With regard to those obligated to bring burnt offerings, the court does not repossess their property in the case of a burnt offering of a woman after childbirth. There is no concern that she might delay bringing her offering, as she is required to bring this offering before partaking of a sacrificial food. The Gemara asks, what is the reason for the ruling that a woman after childbirth is required to bring a burnt offering before she can sacrifice a sin offering? It is that the verse mentions a burnt offering before it mentions her sin offering, as it is written, and when the days of purification are fulfilled, she shall bring a lamb of the first year for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for sin offering, Leviticus 12:6. But doesn't rather say the verse mentions a burnt offering before a sin offering only with regard to the reading of the verse. The interpretation of the Gemara follows Rashi, others explain. The verse mentions her burnt offering before it mentions a sin offering only to teach with regard to the declaration one utters when separating the animals' offering, that she must first declare the burnt offering Rabbeinu Gershom Hagola, 100a, but not with regard to the order of the offerings. If so, there should be a concern that she might first sacrifice the sin offering and delay bringing her burnt offering. While the court does not repossess the property of those obligated to bring burnt offerings in the case of a burnt offering of a leper, as is told in a Braita, then Rabbi Shmuel, son of Rabbi Yehuda ben Baroka, says, just as fair to sacrifice his sin offering, with regard to one who is lacking atonement, including a leper, sacrifice of his sin offering is required in order for him to be permitted to eat sacrificial meat. But sacrifice of his burnt offering and his guilt offering are not required. This halacha is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, son of Rabbi Yehuda ben Baroka, as his is an individual opinion. Therefore, with regard to the burnt offering of a leper, the Rambam rules that the court does not repossess his property, as there is concern he might delay his offering. Lakute halachot Rambam Sefer Kabbalah Yochos Masurei Kapara 1.5. His guilt offering prevents the leper from achieving full ritual purity. So too is failure to sacrifice his burnt offering has the same effect on preventing him from achieving full ritual purity. Therefore, the court does not repossess his property, as there is no concern that he might delay bringing his burnt offering. The Mishnah teaches, although one is obligated to bring burnt offering, the peace offering does not achieve atonement until he brings the offering of his own volition, as is stated, and he shall bring it to the entrance of the meeting of his volition. Leviticus 1.3. Nevertheless, one coerces him until he says, I want to do so. And similarly, the sages taught in a Braita, is written with regard to a burnt offering, he shall sacrifice it. Yaakov also, a similar phrase is stated at the beginning of the verse. Therefore, it is derived from the repetition of, he shall sacrifice it late in the verse. He shall sacrifice it even if it is necessary to coerce him to do so. Similarly, the sages taught in the Braita is written with God, which teaches that one coerces him to bring his burnt offering. One might have thought he brings his offering against his will. Therefore, the verse states of his volition in Leviticus 1.3. How can these texts be reconciled? The court coerces him until he says, I want to do so. Shmuel says the burnt offering requires the consent of the one receiving atonement as stated of his volition. The Gemara asks, what is Samuel teaching us? Did we already learn in the Mishnah Although he does not achieve atonement until he brings the offering with his own volition, as a state he shall bring it to the enter to the meter of his volition. The Gemara answers no. The statement of Shmuel is necessary with regard to a case where another person is separated. I designate a burnt offering on his behalf. Lest you say, when we require the consent of the one achieving atonement, that is only in a case where the animal from his property is separated as a burnt offering. Usually repossesses his property for the sake of his burnt offering, but we do not need his consent if an animal of the property of another is separated as a burnt offering. Therefore, Shmuel teaches us that the consent of the one receiving atonement is required even in a case where the animal from the property of another separated as an offering. The reason is that sometimes he is not amenable to achieving atonement with an item that does not belong to him. The word sometimes apparently indicates that there is merely a concern that he might not be amenable to achieving atonement with an item that does not belong to him, but there is no intrinsic requirement for his explicit consent. Nevertheless, it can be inferred from both the Torah's mention of his volition and the continuation of the discussion in the Gemara that in fact his explicit consent is halachically required in order to consecrate the animal. 21b, and in such a case he will not achieve atonement. The Gemara raises an objection from a writer with regard to one who says, "Is it common upon me to bring the sin offering or the guilt offering of so and so?" If he does so with the consent of the one obligated to bring the offering, he has fulfilled his obligation. But if he does so without the consent of the one obligated to bring the offering, he has not fulfilled his obligation. With regard to the one who says, "It comes upon me to bring the burnt offering or the peace offering of so and so," whether he does so with the latter's consent or without his consent, the one obligated to bring the offering has fulfilled his obligation. This apparently contradicts the statement of Shmuel, who said the bringing of the burnt offering requires the consent of the one obligated to bring the offering. Shmuel could have said to you, when that writer is taught and states that one fulfills his obligation for his burnt offering without his consent, it is referring to the time of the atonement, i.e. the sacrifice. At that stage, his consent is not necessary, as he has already consented at the time of the separating. Some commentaries maintain that once he consented at the moment of separating the animal as an offering, even if he protests at the time of his sacrifice and declares that he does not wish to receive atonement with that offering, fulfills the obligation with that offering to the Rambam. We disagree, arguing that his consent at the moment of separating the animal is considered indicative of his consent to achieve atonement with that offering to the extent that he is not required to issue his consent again. Nevertheless, if he actually protests at the time of sacrifice, he does not fulfill the obligation with that offering. Rabbeinu Gershom Mohagola, Sefer Voda Hilchot Maaseh Korbanot 14:10. The animal is as an offering. When I said the consent of the one receiving atonement is required, I was speaking of the time of separating the animal as an offering, and Shmuel disagrees with the opinion of Ula. Tosfot explained the basis for the disagreement between Shmuel and Ula as follows. Ula maintains the moment of sacrifice, when atonement is achieved and one places his hand on the animal, is of primary concern to one obligated to bring the offering. Therefore, his consent is always necessary at the moment of sacrifice. While at the moment of separating the animal as an offering, his only concern is that he does not wish to achieve atonement with an item that does not belong to him. The concern is relevant only to a sin offering and a guilt offering, which are brought for atonement. It is not relevant in the cases of burnt offering and a peace offering, as they are not brought for atonement. In contrast, Shmuel contends that the concern that a person does not wish to receive atonement with an item that does not belong to him applies to all offerings, and therefore consent is always required at the moment of separation. Yet, consent is required at the time of sacrifice only with regard to the sin offering and the guilt offering, as they are brought for atonement and require confession as part of the atonement process of placing one's hands on the animal. This is not the case with regard to a burnt offering and a peace offering. As well as says, the stage is distinguished between the consent required for a sin offering or a guilt offering, consent required for a burnt offering or a peace offering, only in that a sin offering and a guilt offering require consent of the one obligated to bring the offering at the time the other person separates the animal for an offering on his behalf, and a burnt offering and a peace offering do not require his consent at the time of separating the animal. With regard to both this pair of offerings and that pair of offerings at the time of atonement, the requisite consent is the same for all offerings. If the offering was sacrificed with his consent, he has fulfilled his obligation. If it was not sacrificed with his consent, he has not fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara raises an objection to the opinion of both Shmuel and Ula from a Brisa. One who says, "Is it coming upon me to bring the sin offering or the guilt offering or the burnt offering or the peace offering of so and so?" In the case of when it says, "Come upon me to bring the sin offering or guilt offering or burnt offering or the peace offering," so and so, if the person he specified wants him to bring that offering on his behalf, he may let him do so, and he thereby achieves atonement. If at the moment of separating the animal as an offering, one is obligated to bring the offering, wants the other to bring it on his behalf, but at the time of sacrifice he no longer consents, with regard to a burnt offering and a peace offering, the other can sacrifice the offering and he achieves atonement, despite the fact that he does not give his consent at the moment of sacrifice. But in the case of a sin offering or guilt offering, the obligated to bring the offering does not achieve atonement unless he consents also at the moment of sacrifice. Arakhin, in accordance to the opinion of Shmuel, in Sefer Voni Hilchot Maaseh Korbanot 14:10. If he does this with the consent of the one obligated to bring the offering, then that individual has fulfilled his obligation. If he does so without the consent of the one obligated to bring the offering, that person has not fulfilled his obligation. This price is difficult for the opinion of Shmuel, who hold that one who brings a burnt offering on behalf of another does not require consent at the time of atonement, and it is also difficult according to the opinion of Ullah, who maintains that one who brings a burnt offering on behalf of another does not need consent when the animal is set aside as an offering. The Gemara answers, Shmuel establishes the Braita, which requires consent, referring to the time of separating the animal, and Ullah establishes the Braita as dealing with the required consent at the time of atonement. Rav Papa says, in some way, the Braita are not difficult, as they do not contradict each other. This one is referring to consent. Sorry, this is important. This is referring to the time of atonement, and that is referring to consent at the time of separating the animal. Rav Papa adds that the Braita are not difficult for the opinions of the Amoraim. Shmuel establishes the first Braita, which does not require consent for a burnt offering and a peace offering, as referring to the time of atonement, and the last Braita, which requires consent for those offerings, as speaking of the time of separating the animal. Ullah establishes the Braita in the reverse manner. The first Braita, which does not require consent for a burnt offering and a peace offering, dealing with the time of separating the animal, whereas the second Braita referring to the time of atonement. But the Amoraim themselves, Shmuel and Ullah, certainly disagree with each other. The Gemara asks, isn't this summary of the opinions of Shmuel and Ullah obvious? The Gemara answers, Rav Papa's summary is necessary. Let's just say, what does it mean that which Shmuel says? That the consent of the one obligated to bring the offering is required at the time of separating the animal. Shmuel means that consent is required not only at the time of atonement, but even at the time of separating the animal. And even though, according to this interpretation, the first Braita, which says that consent is not required for a burnt offering or for a peace offering, would be a refutation of the opinion of Shmuel, that difficulty would not deter him from holding such an opinion. Therefore, Rav Papa teaches us that the Braita do not contradict the opinion of Shmuel and Ullah, which indicates that Shmuel holds that consent is required only when the animal is separated, but not at the time of atonement. The Mishnah teaches, and likewise, you say the same with regard to women's bills of divorce. Although one can divorce his wife only of his own volition, in any case where the sage obligates a husband to divorce his wife, the court coerces him until he says, I want to do so. Sheshes said, concerning one who delivered a declaration preempting invalidating the bill of divorce by announcing before giving the bill of divorce that he is not doing so of his own free will, declaration is a valid declaration that cancels the bill of divorce. The Gemara asks, isn't it obvious? The Gemara answers, no, the statement of Rav Sheshes is necessary in a case where they coerced him to give a bill of divorce, and he declared that he was not giving it of his own free will, but later he agreed to give the bill of divorce of his own volition without explicitly retracting his original declaration that he was coerced. That you say merely by giving a bill of divorce he has cancelled his earlier declaration that he was coerced. Sheshes therefore teaches us that his original declaration that he was coerced is still in effect, and the bill of divorce is cancelled. The Gemara explains how Rav Sheshes derives his conclusion from the Mishnah. The reason is that if it was so, i.e., if his original declaration is cancelled even without an explicit retraction, then the Mishnah teach, the court coerces him until he gives the bill of divorce of his own volition. What is the significance of the clause? The court coerces him until he says, I want to do so. This indicates that the court coerces him until he explicitly cancels his original declaration. If one issued a preemptive declaration in front of two witnesses invalidating bill of divorce by saying, with regard to the bill of divorce that I am giving to my wife, let it be known that I am being coerced into divorcing her, and therefore I am declaring before you that the bill of divorce is null and void, and the bill of divorce is null and void. Even if the man gives his wife a bill of divorce afterward, he has not yet cancelled his preemptive declaration until he explicitly says he is cancelling it, in which case his preemptive declaration is nullified. Therefore, one who wishes to divorce his wife must cancel any preemptive declarations he might have issued before he writes a bill of divorce. He must say, I thereby cancel all preemptive declaration that I made with regard to this bill of divorce. The halacha is according to the opinion of Rav Ashi, Raman Sefer Nashim Hilchot Gerushin 620, Shulchan Aruch Even Ezra 134 1-2. And the summary on the 5th parak. This chapter began with the case of one who vowed to donate his weight. If he mentioned a particular material, he must give his weight in that material. If he did not specify material, he must give his weight in any material that he chooses, provided the merchants of that place sell that material by weight. If the individual is wealthy, then even if he did not specify a material, he must fulfill his vow in keeping with his socio-economic status. With regard to the one who says, it is incumbent upon me to donate the weight of my forearm or the weight of my leg, one estimates the weight of the limb. It is not necessary to calculate its weight by placing it in water and weighing a measure of donkey flesh that displaces a similar quantity in water. In this connection, the Gemara discussed the definitions of the terms forearm, yad, and leg, regel, in light of the principle that with regard to vows, one follows the ordinary language of people. Accordingly, the term yad generally refers to the forearm until the elbow, while regel refers to the leg below the knee. If one vows it is incumbent upon me to donate the assessment of my forearm, the court does not assess the forearm by evaluating the difference between how much he would be sold for as a slave with both hands as opposed to someone with one hand severed, which is the manner of calculating damages. Rather, the court assesses how much less a person is willing to pay for a slave who works with one hand than for one slave who works with two hands. The Gemara also discussed whether assessment in general is a halachic decision or technical approach is merely designed to establish the facts of the matter. No conclusion was reached with regard to this question. The chapter touched upon some of the differences between vows of assessment and valuation. There are certain halachot and they're more stringent in the case of vows of assessment than in evaluation. For example, if one says it comes upon me to donate the assessment of my forearm or of my leg, he must give that assessment. The contrast, if he says it comes upon me to donate the valuation of my forearm or of my leg, is not to anything of consequence, as valuation only applies to a whole person. Nevertheless, one who evaluates an item upon which his life depends and without which he will die must give the evaluation of his entire self. Another halacha that is more stringent in vows of assessment than in valuations, in that vows of assessment take effect with regard to animals as well as people, whereas valuations apply only to people. Furthermore, the poor who take vows of assessment are not assessed based on affordability, where the valuations are. The other halachot are more stringent in valuations than in vows of assessment. For example, if one says it comes upon me to donate my valuation and he subsequently died, his heirs must give his valuation to the temple treasury. But if he says it comes upon me to donate my assessment and he died, his heirs need not give his assessment to the temple treasury. There is no monetary value for the dead. The chapter continued with an examination of the financial stability of one who consecrated an animal or a house. If the animal consequently died or the house collapsed, the ruling in this case depends on the language of the vow. If the individual specified a particular animal in his vow, then he does not bear financial responsibility if the animal dies. If he vowed the monetary value of an animal, then he does bear with financial responsibility in the event of the animal's death. In the case of one who vowed to consecrate property to the temple treasury but did not pay his debt, the court repossesses his property. The repossessed property may be sold and the proceeds used as payment. or the property may be used as collateral in order to force one who took the vow to pay. Just as the court repossesses the property of one who is obligated to pay the temple treasury, so too they repossess property in order to coerce someone who is obligated to bring a vow offering to the temple. But with regard to one who is obligated to bring an offering for atonement, one does not repossess his property, as there is no concern that he might delay bringing such an offering. In cases where the court does coerce someone to bring his offering, in order to comply with the requirement, he must bring it of his own volition until they coerce him until he wants to bring it. The chapter further analyzes whether one may bring an offering on another's behalf without his consent, or whether the consent of the one obligated to bring an offering is necessary. This issue is the subject of a dispute among the sages. The extent of opinion with regard to burnt offerings and peace offerings, consent is necessary only at the time of separating the animal as an offering. The offerings are not brought for the sake of atonement, but with regard to sin offerings and guilt offerings, which are brought for the sake of atonement, consent is necessary at the time of sacrifice as well. And then we're going to the introduction of Parak 6. And the posuk, if he is too poor for your valuation, then he shall be set before the priest, and the priest shall evaluate him according to the means of he that vowed shall the priest evaluate him. And Leviticus 27:8. He shall give you valuation that day as a holy thing to the Lord. Leviticus 27:23. This chapter begins by discussing the appraisal of property for the purpose of redeeming it from the possession of the temple treasury, and likewise the appraisal of the property of a deceased individual for the purpose of paying a pre-existing debt in cases where the deceased property was inherited by minor orphans who are unable to sell the properties themselves. In both instances, in the interest of obtaining the highest possible offer for the property, the sale is delayed for a period of time in order to allow for the submission of such an offer. In this context, several issues require clarification. For how long is the sale delayed? Is it delayed for consecrated property and property inherited by orphans? What is the nature of the proclamation for the sale? Are there specific guidelines for the proclamation? At the end of the chapter, the manner of appraisal is addressed as well, i.e., whether it is appraised according to its value or its current location, or according to the highest possible price one could obtain for the property, even if this required traveling to another place. Since the parameters of the appraisal of property inherited by orphans are discussed in this chapter, it also discusses a halacha involving the sale of property inherited by orphans for the purpose of paying a debt owed by their father. This is the general assumption that it is preferable to refrain from dealing with such debts until the orphans can do so themselves when they attain majority. Yet, in certain cases, it is not possible to delay payment, as any delay occurs at the expense of the creditor or the wife of the deceased who is entitled to the payment of a marriage contract. The problem is that minor orphans are often incapable of addressing claims issued against the father's estate, either because they are unaware of his dealings or due to concern that the creditor might submit false claims against their father. It is therefore necessary to clarify in which instances the court, which in a sense performs the role of the father of the orphans, attends to their property in order to sell it for the purpose of paying a debt. Is there a distinction in this regard between claims that are certainly valid and others that require clarification? Furthermore, is there a difference between a wife's marriage contract and other debts? This chapter likewise discusses various issues involving cases where one consecrates his property after there was already a lien on it due to a debt or marriage contract. May the creditor claim payment directly from the temple treasury? Is the legal status of a lien property that was consecrated identical to that of a lien property that was sold? Or is special halacha in this instance? Furthermore, is there concern that a husband might collude with his wife against the temple treasury, i.e., that he will divorce her, she will collect the payment of a marriage contract on the consecrated property, and he will subsequently remarry her? Other cases of a similar nature are this as well: whether a wife collects her marriage contract from a guarantor, or if she takes from property that others have purchased from her husband. The last section of this chapter returns to the topic of the previous chapter, repossessing the property from those obligated to pay valuations or other dues to the temple treasury. The following issues are addressed: is all of one's property repossessed in order to pay such obligations, including personal items? What about those required to perform one's craft and one's phylacteries? Finally, is the property of one's wife, children also repossessed? All these questions are touched upon at the end of the chapter. One proclaims, i.e., publicly announces the appraisal of the property inherited by minor orphans, which is being sold to repay their father's debt for 30 days. When the court sells property belonging to orphans, they assess the land and proclaim its appraisal for 30 consecutive days in the morning and evening. Mishpatim, 109, 1 and Ibn Ezra 104:1 in order to receive the maximum price. And one proclaims the appraisal of consecrated property that is being sold by the temple treasury for 60 days. Any field that the temple treasury sells in accordance with its monetary value is appraised, and its appraisal is proclaimed for 60 consecutive days in the morning and in the evening. Rabban Sefer Flah, Arakhin Daf 427 C32. One proclaims it in the morning and in the evening. The Gemara asks, what is different about those times that one proclaims of the appraisal of the property specifically in the morning and in the evening? Rabbi Yehuda says that Rav says, one proclaims during that time that workers leave. When the court intends to sell property inherited by orphans, they assess the land. The same applies to the temple treasury, which can sell consecrated property in accordance with the monetary value. The appraisal is proclaimed in the morning and the evening when the workers enter the field and when they leave. Anyone interested in purchasing the field will send the workers to inspect the quality of the field on his behalf. When the sale of the field is proclaimed, the borders of the field are announced as well as its quality and the amount it was appraised at by the court. In the case of a field of orphans, the reason for the sale is also announced, i.e. to procure payment either of an inherited debt of the marriage contract of a wife. And Sefer Mishpat Mehilchot Mal Valova 12:8 and Sefer Flah Hilchot Arakhin Daf 427 Shulchan Aruch Mishpat 109:1 and Ibn Ezra 104:1. To work in the field and during the time that the workers enter. The translation of Gemara follows the explanation of Rashi. Although early commentaries maintain that the time that workers leave is the evening, when they leave the field after completing their work. At this point, one might ask them to inspect the field that is for sale, and the next morning when they enter the field to begin their work, they will be reminded of his request and will ask about their inspection. These commentaries interpret the Gemara in this manner because workers are not permitted to leave their work in order to inspect another field in the middle of the day. Tosfot Rebbeinu Gershom Mohagola, amends the text of Rashi to conform to this opinion. The city, after completing their work, Rabbi Yehuda elaborates. One proclaims during the time that workers leave to work in the fields. So if there is a person who is amenable to purchasing the property, he might say to the workers, "Go and examine the property for me." One proclaims during the time that workers enter the city, so that the individual will be reminded that he said to the workers he should inspect the property, and he will go and ask them for their opinion of it. The Gemara notes that explanation is also taught in a Braita. One proclaims the appraisal of the property inherited by mourner or orphan for 30 days. Proclaims the appraisal of consecrated property for 60 days. One proclaims it in the morning and in the evening during the time that the workers leave to work in the field and during the time that the workers enter the city after completing their workday. The Braita adds that the one who proclaims states the field of so-and-so that is identifiable by its mark and its borders, such is its quality, i.e. produces such and such quantities of grain annually, and such is its appraisal. Some explain that the phrase "such is its quality" means that such is the amount people are currently offering to pay for the field, and the phrase "such is its appraisal" means that such is the amount by which its appraisal exceeds current offers. That's the respondent of Ramban 11 Sefer Hamicha Hamika of Rav Haigon chapter 6. Anyone who wishes to purchase the field, let him come and purchase it. He adds that the field is being sold in order to give the proceeds to a wife as payment of a marriage contract. The marriage contract is a document that contains a monetary stipulation between a couple, most notably the husband's pledge to his wife to pay his wife at least 200 dinars in the case of a woman who was a virgin when she married, in the case of their divorce or his death. The legal status of a marriage contract is like that of any other promissory note. In order to give a creditor payment of a deceased man's debt, the Gemara asks, why do I need the one making the proclamation to say that the field is being sold in order to give the proceeds to a wife as payment of a marriage contract, or to give a creditor payment of his debt? The Gemara responds, this declaration is necessary as there are individuals for whom it is preferable to do business with a creditor. The reason that this is a relevant fact is because the one who purchased the field inherited by orphans does not pay them. Rather, buyer pays the credit to the wife directly, he essentially pays off the debt inherited by orphans, as he is lenient with dinars. What does that mean? According to some commentators, this shows that the court does not permit the creditor to inspect the quality of the coins. Rather, they say to him, according to the popular adage, when collecting a debt from your debtor, allow yourself to be paid even in bran. Rebbeinu Gershom Mohagola, Siba Metzia 118a. And will accept even damaged coins, and there are others for whom it's preferable to deal with a wife, as she takes the money bit by bit in incremental payments. That's the end of the Omid. Thank you very much for listening. Feel free to subscribe and make any comments, feedback, and wish you all the best. Have a good day. Bye.